Right, it's 4 o'clock now, so I think we can kick things off. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Elaine Drayton, and I'll be chairing today's event, which is the penultimate IFS public lecture. Just to highlight that our final lecture will be on the same time next week, and that will be titled Why Tax Corporate Income. But on to today, I'm delighted that we'll be joined by Ben Waltman, who's a senior research economist at the IFS. He has interest in education, particularly in returns to education and funding models of education. Today, he'll be talking to us about the economics of higher education, and he'll be presenting roughly for 40 minutes. After that time, we'll have a short Q&A session, and you'll be able to submit any questions via the Slido app, or alternatively, you can vote for the questions that you'd like to be asked. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Ben.
Hello. So I'm going to talk about the economics of higher education today. And in particular, I want to address three questions. The first is, why do people go to university? And I'm going to outline a little economic model of higher education choices to think about that. Secondly, why do most governments intervene in the market for higher education? So first, I'm going to look at what different governments do, and then think a little bit about what could be their reasons in the framework of the model presented in the first part. And third, I want to look at what are the financial benefits of higher education. Where I'll touch on the question how one could find out. And then using those methods that I've presented, I'll show you some results for England. Throughout, this lecture is probably a bit more mathematical than other lectures in this series, but I will try to highlight the intuition behind all the maths. So if you can't exactly follow something, don't worry about it. I'm gonna try to make sense of it, even if you can't follow the maths. So on to why do people go to university? What I would encourage you to ask if you're an undergraduate, ask yourself, or indeed if you've already graduated from university, why did you decide to go to university? Did you go to get a more fulfilling job? Did you go to earn more money, or were you just interested in the pure joy of learning, for example? Similarly, you might ask, why did other people not go to university? Maybe they never wanted to sit an exam again. Maybe they didn't want to have to leave home, or maybe they just enjoyed practical work more than academic work. So to make sense of all these different reasons for going to university or not going, I want to outline a little model of higher education choices. So suppose there are two periods, t=1 and t=2. In the first period, which I'm going to call youth, people choose whether to go to university or whether to start work straight away. In the second period, which I'm going to call working life, everyone goes to work. In the first period, person I's income is going to be minus FHE if they go to university, so F here for fees, which they have to pay, and Y1I non-HE if they don't go to university, because if you don't go to university, you can earn an income straight away. In the second period, person I's income is going to be Y2I HE if they went to university, and Y2I non-HE if they did not go to university. And just to visualize this, so here's the first period, youth. So if you go to university, which is in pink here, you get minus FHE because you have to pay fees. But if you don't go to university, you can earn an income Y1I non-HE. Whereas in working life, you earn an income whether or not you go to university. And typically we think that the earnings that you're going to have if you do go to university, Y2I HE, are going to be higher than if you don't go to university. So part of what going to university is an investment which pays off in later life. And throughout this lecture, I'm going to assume that there's no uncertainty about earnings. So prospective new students know what's going to happen later. That's of course not quite true, but it's a useful simplifying assumption here. So I'm going to assume that something about people's preferences first. In particular, what I'm going to assume is that people's utility function takes this following Cobb-Douglas form. So utility of person I is going to be phi I times C1I to the 1/2 times C2I to the 1/2, where C1I and C2I are consumption in periods t = 1 and t = 2 respectively. So C1I is how much you can consume when you're young, and C2I is how much you can consume in working life. And phi I is going to be the non-monetary value of each option. What does that mean? Well, phi I could contain, if you're going to university, the value of a more fulfilling job, the joy of knowledge, all of the good things about university that aren't a higher income. And if you're not going to university, on the other hand, it might contain things like the value of never having to take exams again, the value of not having to move away from home, or the joy of practical work. Furthermore, I'm going to assume that people can borrow any amount, BI, B for borrowing here, from financial markets at the interest rate R. So then, given what we've assumed before, we have some budget constraints. So for people who go to university, or if you go to university, the budget constraint is going to be consumption in the first period is going to be whatever you borrow minus the fees that you have to pay. And in the second period, it's going to be Y2IHE, your income in the second period, minus paying back whatever you borrowed with interest. So that's 1 plus R. Putting those two things together, eliminating the BIHE, gives us this consolidated budget constraint here. So that just means that the future value of consumption is going to have to equal the future value of income. So essentially, you can only spend your income looked at over the 2 periods. And then similarly, for those who don't go to university, we're going to have a consolidated budget constraint that looks very similar, which I've put down here. So if we put those things together now, we can display the budget constraint and the preferences on a diagram like this, which if you've done some microeconomics, you might be familiar with. First, thinking about the case where you don't go to university, so that's the green budget constraint here. That is you've got an endowment point here, which is income in the first period and income in the second period. And this person is going to choose to borrow if they don't go to university. So they end up with a consumption bundle here, which is the consumption bundle where the budget constraint is tangent to the highest indifference curve here. And similarly for the higher education case, the endowment is up here. So unlike what you've seen before, we've got the kind of first period endowment in negative territory because you have to pay fees, but basically that doesn't really change anything substantive. Then you've got your budget constraint here for if you go to university. And again, this is the highest indifference curve. So the consumption bundle is where the highest indifference curve is tangent to the budget constraint. And again, you see that this person is going to borrow money in the first period. So consumption in the first period is higher than the endowment. The pink budget constraint here is outside the green budget constraint or higher, which means that if this person goes to university, she can consume more. That doesn't necessarily mean that she will go to university because, as we've seen, there are also non-monetary factors. Consumption isn't everything. So if she enjoys practical work more and that outweighs the higher earnings that she might get if she goes to university, she might still choose not to go. Okay, so if we solve this constraint optimization problem, to get C1i star and C2i star, which you may have done before in a microeconomics class for both the university and non-university case. And we substitute those consumption levels back into the utility function to get UI-HE and UI non-HE. Then we'll find that people are going to choose university. So people choose university if and only if the utility of going is higher than the utility of not going. So that's by definition. But if we plug it in, we can put some meat on the bones of this. So then we get the inequality at the bottom here, which tells you that the non-monetary value of going to HE times the future value of earnings. So everything you earn basically over the life cycle when you go to university is greater than the non-monetary value of not going times the future value of earnings if you don't go. If the left-hand side is greater than the right-hand side, then you'll go, and if it's smaller, then you won't go. So that's our theory. I've reproduced the inequality here, and I just wanted to highlight what we can learn from this. So factors pushing people towards higher education are going to be a high non-monetary value of higher education, low tuition fees, FHE, see this term is negative, or high earnings after university, Y2IHE. But also a low non-monetary value of not going to university is going to push you towards higher education, as well as low non-HE earnings, Y1I non-HE or Y2I non-HE here. And maybe not as intuitively, in this model with a private market in higher education, interest rates also matter a lot. So if interest rates are low, then more people are going to go to university, because as you can see, it enters negatively here and positively there. So assuming that these three things hold true, so students can borrow from financial markets at the true social cost of funds, higher education only benefits students themselves, and young people have perfect foresight and make optimal choices from their own point of view, then the higher education choices that prospective students are going to make in this model are going to be efficient. Just to recap what we've learned in this section, so we now have a theory of higher education choice when there's a private market in higher education and a functioning financial market. People are going to choose higher education if and only if it is better for them. Whether it is better for them depends on a number of factors, some to do with money, others not. And in particular, in the model I've outlined, people are going to choose higher education if and only if this inequality here holds true. So remember, this is the non-monetary value of higher education. This is basically your lifetime earnings if you attend university, and that needs to be greater than the non-monetary value of not going times your lifetime earnings if you don't go to university, for you to choose to go to university in this model. And under some assumptions, these choices are going to be economically efficient. So that's the first part. In the next section, I want to look at why might higher education choices not be efficient, and what do governments in practice do about that? So why do most governments intervene in the market for higher education? So there are different ways of funding higher education that different countries have chosen. We've looked at a model of an entirely private market in higher education in the last section, but in fact, most countries do not have an entirely private market. In the US, there's a partly private market, but there's a substantial state sector, so state university sector, which offers subsidized tuition fees, and there are large grant programs for poorer students. In England and Australia, the system relies mostly on income contingent loans. So those are loans that are paid back, as a percentage of earnings above a certain threshold. And the outstanding balances on those loans are written off after some years of repayment. In England, that's 30 years, and that works out to a substantial subsidy for most graduates. In Germany and Scotland, for example, we have no tuition fees that are charged, including for postgraduates, and subsidized loans are available for living costs. Whereas in Denmark and Sweden, first of all, no tuition fees are charged, but students are also entitled to living cost grants. So something like a salary for going to university. And looking at this, as an economist, you might ask, what is the point of these government loans and subsidies? If the benefits of higher education, whether non-financial or financial, accrue to the students themselves, why does the government need to get involved at all? Doesn't the private market attain the efficient outcome? Well, these are the assumptions from the last section. So assuming that we've assumed that students can borrow from financial markets at the true social cost of funds, higher education only benefits students themselves, and young people have perfect foresight and make optimal choices from their own point of view, well, then the higher education choices in this model are going to be efficient. But it's kind of unclear whether any of these assumptions holds in reality. So in fact, I'm going to try to convince you that because these assumptions don't perfectly hold, the outcome of a private market might in fact not be efficient, or is unlikely to be efficient. So first, and perhaps most importantly, private financial markets may not work well in practice, leading to high costs of borrowing for prospective students. Secondly, higher education may have positive externalities. So that means that it may not only benefit students themselves, but also benefit others. And third, some students may choose not to go to university, even if going to university would be optimal for them. And the consequence of that is what economists call market failure. So if the higher education market was completely private, fewer young people would go to university than would be optimal. So by subsidizing higher education, governments may be looking to raise the higher education participation rates, so how many people actually go to university, to the optimal level. So let's look at all of this in a bit more detail. So first, I want to start with financial market imperfections. So what I'm going to claim is that the interest rate R charged on student loans may in fact be much higher than the true social cost of funds. And one reason for that is called limited enforceability. So for student loans, in contrast to, say, a mortgage, there's no collateral. Then if people look to escape repayment, so they don't want to repay their loans, the lender has a problem because there's no house they can seize or anything like that. And the legal process of forcing someone to pay if they don't want to pay and nothing can be seized is going to be costly and may not always be successful. So the consequence of that is going to be that the interest rate R is going to be much higher than the true social cost of funds. So some people are going to be put off going to university by the high cost of loans. So we can think of this in the terms of the model that I outlined in the last section. So here again is the key inequality from that. So if R goes up, the term on the left is going to go down, and the term on the right, because of this here, is going to go up. So fewer people are going to go to university. So in terms of the diagram that I showed, we can think of this as a pivot. For those of you who've seen this sort of thing before, you can think of the relative price of first period consumption as 1 plus the interest rate. So if the interest rate goes up here, the budget constraint is going to pivot around the endowment point. So you can see here. And so what's happened here is that before, it was financially lucrative for this person to attend university. See, the pink budget constraint was outside of the green budget constraint. And after a pivot here around the endowment point, this is reversed. So now it's the green budget constraint is outside of the pink budget constraint. And this person is actually financially better off by going to university, by not going to university, sorry. Okay, second, positive externalities. So in fact, higher education may not only benefit students themselves, but may also benefit others. And one important channel for this are so-called human capital spillovers. So working and living alongside university-educated people is the idea here, might create learning opportunities for others. And there's a large economic literature on this. A classic paper is Moretti 2004, who finds that an increased share of college graduates in a city raises the productivity of other workers in that city. A more recent contribution, for example, is Chen and co-authors in 2020, who found that sending Chinese university students to live and work in the countryside during the Chinese Cultural Revolution raised the education levels of rural children. Another channel are higher tax revenues as a result of university graduates' higher earnings. So in some of my own work at IFS, I found, together with some co-authors, that nearly half the financial gain for men and around a quarter of the financial gain for women from going to university actually accrues to the taxpayer. And so these are likely the most important effects: human capital spillovers and fiscal externalities. But there may be others. So, for instance, education, we know, also leads to lower crime, higher civic engagement, spillovers from better health. So that means that it may be socially optimal for more people to go to university than would be privately optimal. So the solution to this, for those of you who've done some public economics, is a Pigouvian subsidy. So basically what you want to do as the government is subsidize higher education in order to raise higher education investment to the socially optimal level. Just to flag, this is not a closed case, as it were. There are also reasons to think that it might be socially optimal for fewer people to go to university than would be privately optimal. This is a complicated case. So if, for instance, higher education is partly a costly signal of productivity to employers, there may be overinvestment in higher education in the private market. And the classic reference for that is Spence 1973. I'm not going to dwell on that very much, because while that's kind of gets a lot of attention, that story, I think the most researchers in the higher education space would agree that on balance, the positive externalities probably outweigh these signaling effects and similar. Finally, privately suboptimal decisions. So prospective students may underestimate the benefits of higher education. That's one reason why they might not decide to go, and that would be suboptimal. So that could be because they have imperfect information about what are the financial and non-financial benefits of going to university. And that, as you can imagine, is likely to especially affect people from disadvantaged backgrounds, because perhaps they are the first in their family to go to university, and perhaps their parents also don't have lots of friends who go to university. And for those reasons, that it might be very difficult for them to know what it's actually like to go to university and what the labor market is like if you are a graduate. Secondly, apart from those information problems, there might be so-called internalities. So students may know that university would be best, but maybe they just can't bring themselves to apply or actually go to university. So the policy options here, so the government obviously can provide more information, and in the UK, that's been very high on the policy agenda. And secondly, they can again make university more attractive by subsidizing it, which is what we observe in practice that many governments do. So how might government intervention look in the model that I outlined in the first part of this lecture? So suppose the main problem is that the market for student loans does not work well. So that's the first issue that I mentioned. Then a natural solution might be for the government to borrow on students' behalf. So how could that look like? So we could have in period one, so the government might borrow money from financial markets and use that money to pay for students' fees and living costs while they're at university. And in period 2, the government could tax graduates to pay off what it borrowed. This sort of tax is often called a graduate tax. That's not going to restore the same allocation, as meaning that students aren't going to make the same choices as they would in a completely private market, because the government doesn't know how much each individual would have borrowed from the financial markets. But it could come relatively close. It also, in this sort of system, the government can subsidize the system of higher education finance in order to further encourage higher education participation. So how can we capture this policy in the model? Well, instead of having students pay fees, FHE, students would get living cost grants, which I'm going to call LHE in the first period. And then students have to pay a graduate tax, tau HE, of their working life earnings and their working lives. And I'm going to assume that individuals can't borrow at all to make this a bit simpler, or their interest rates are just prohibitively high, so nobody chooses to borrow. So then we don't have to actually solve a constraint optimization problem here, because everyone is just going to consume their endowment. So people just spend what they get in each period. So for students, consumption in the first period is going to be the living cost grant that they get, and consumption in the second period is going to be equal to 1 minus tau HE, so the graduate tax, times the second period income. And for non-students, we're just going to have people consuming their earnings in both periods. So if we substitute those consumption levels into the utility function, we get, for the higher education case, this equation, and for the non-HE case, we get that equation. And then again, people are going to choose higher education if and only if the utility of going to university is greater than the utility of not going, which is then going to be this expression. That looks pretty similar to what we had before. Instead of lifetime earnings, we here have the geometric mean of earnings in the first period and earnings and net earnings in the second period. But if that means nothing to you, don't worry. Basically, the point is it's pretty similar to what we had in the first part of the lecture. And so basically, you might think that the government has nearly restored the optimal allocation here. So another thing to note about this is that the government, as I said, can adjust this tau HE and the LHE in order to make more or less make university more or less attractive. So that could kind of counteract or adjust for some of the externalities here. So we can build the subsidy into the system. So arguably, this model captures the higher education funding system in England quite well. So English students pay no fees up front and receive money for living costs from the government. And then graduates pay back a percentage, which is currently 9% of their later life earnings, above an earnings threshold, which is currently 27,300. So you might ask, well, hang on a minute, doesn't the English system rely on student loans? And that's right. But in fact, the majority of students are never going to pay off their loans. So for most, the system is actually just like this tax, as I described it. So just to recap what I've talked about, so a completely private market in higher education is quite rare. Most countries instead subsidize higher education, but systems vary a bit. There are 3 justifications for the government to intervene in the market for higher education that I mentioned. The first is financial market imperfections, the second is positive externalities, and the third is privately suboptimal decisions. And if we adapt our model for government funding paid for by a graduate tax, students are going to choose higher education if and only if this inequality at the bottom here holds. So that's the non-monetary value of going to university times the geometric mean of the consumption levels in both periods being greater than the non-monetary value of not going to university times the geometric mean of the consumption levels if you don't go to university. Okay, final issue I want to talk about, what are the financial benefits of higher education? So what we want to know here is what's often called the financial return to higher education. So how much are an individual I's working life earnings in percent as a result of going to university? So the comparison is what person I would have earned had she not gone to university. So that's important information, both for prospective students who are thinking about whether or not to attend university, and it's important information for the government thinking about the design of the higher education funding system. However, I should emphasize that financial returns, of course, are only one part of the benefit of higher education for individuals. Going to university also may mean that you will be healthier or happier later in life, as well as for society. So we've talked about externalities in the previous section. So if you think about it in terms of our model, what we're going to want to estimate is the later life percentage earnings return, which I'm going to call rho I, which is going to be Y2I HE minus Y2I non-HE divided by non-HE earnings. So how much higher in percent of your non-HE earnings are going to be your second period earnings if you go to university. So just some more notations. I'm going to define this indicator variable here, DIHE, which is going to be 1 if person I goes to university, and otherwise it's going to be 0. And suppose we've got data on working life earnings, Y2I, this DIHE, so we know whether someone went to university or not, and the vector of background characteristics, which I'm going to call XI. And then I'm going to assume that second period earnings for both HE and non-HE, so whether or not you go to university, are given by the following Mincer type earnings equation. That's Y2I will equal e to the power of alpha 0 plus alpha 1 DIHE plus XI beta. So XI, remember, is our vector of observables plus a UI, which is an unobservable component that we as the econometricians don't observe. So don't worry if you haven't seen this before. We're going to get to something kind of more manageable in a minute. So, but first note that I've assumed here that the alpha 1 is fixed across individuals, which we're going to relax to some extent later. So if we substitute this expression now into the expression for rho I, we're going to get rho I equals rho. So the rho is going to be fixed. And that's going to be e to the power of alpha 1 minus 1, which is actually, if you are familiar with this sort of thing, almost the same thing as rho. So rho and alpha 1 are going to be pretty near each other. In fact, alpha 1 is going to be what you might call that a log point return. That knowing that alpha 1 is going to allow us to get at the rho. So if we take logs of both sides of this earnings equation, we're going to get this, which might look more familiar to people. We have log earnings on the left-hand side, and then something that very much looks like a regression equation. And UI is going to be a random error term from the point of view of the econometrician, i.e. us as the researchers. So can we estimate alpha 1 by OLS regression? Which is, if you've done any econometrics, you'll have seen that. So the crucial assumption here is the central OLS assumption. So the expected value of UI given the XI and DIHE is going to be 0. That's what we have to assume. So that implies that conditional on the other regressors, each regressor has to be uncorrelated with UI. And as we're interested in the alpha 1, the crucial condition for us is this one down here. So conditional on the observables, our error term UI has to be uncorrelated with this choice indicator DIHE. And otherwise, we're going to get what's called omitted variable bias or selection bias. So what does this assumption mean for people who haven't done very much econometrics? So for instance, this UI may contain some unobserved factors that are valuable in the labor market. So you might think of charm or self-confidence or strong work ethic or curiosity as things that are valuable in the labor market, i.e. allow you to get higher income, but which a researcher can't observe. And this assumption then is going to say that conditional on what we observe about people, these unobserved factors are uncorrelated with whether someone goes to university. So that means looking at people with the same observable characteristics, so who got the same marks at school, who are from a similar socioeconomic background, and so on. Do people who are charming, self-confident, etc., and no more likely or unlikely to go to university? If that's plausible, then I think we're good. If it's not true, the OLS estimate, so the estimate that comes out of this method of estimating the financial returns to higher education, is going to be picking up differences in the effect of these unobservable factors, which will then falsely be attributed to going to university. So how can we make progress on thinking about this assumption? Well, one possible guide is the theory from the previous sections. So we showed that in the model with government subsidies funded by a graduate tax, we're going to have people going to university if and only if this inequality holds. So if we then substitute in the equation for the second period earnings, we're going to get this thing here. And as you can see, a lot cancels out here, including the UI, because background factors equally affect the utility if you go to university and if you don't go. So in the model, the DI-HE does not directly depend on UI. So we could still have it be correlated if the phi-I-HE, the phi-I non-HE, or the Y1I non-HE are correlated with the UI, even conditional on our vector of observables xi. So again, to think about the intuition here, so we said, well, maybe curiosity is part of UI, and that may positively affect earnings and might be positively correlated with DI-HE. So it might make you go to university, because if you're curious, you might have a higher non-monetary value of higher education, phi-I-HE. Then what we would overestimate the financial benefit of going to university alpha 1, because we would falsely attribute to going to university what really is a result of curiosity. In contrast, we might think that strong work ethic, for instance, is also part of UI, and that positively affects earnings, but is negatively correlated with DI-HE through Y1I non-HE. So people who have strong work ethic can earn more if they go to if they don't go to university while they're young. Then we would underestimate the alpha 1. So more generally, the UI is only going to cancel out from the HE decision rule in our particular model that I've outlined, basically because I've rigged it up in this way. So that depends on the Cobb-Douglas preference that I've assumed, and it depends on the earnings function. So the general takeaway here is that the UI could affect the HE participation decision, DI-HE, either directly or indirectly, as I've outlined. But now, finally, moving on to kind of what actual estimates are, we're going to assume that this works. So the OLS, the exogeneity assumption holds that I've shown you. And the data set where this was most plausible for England is the LEO data set, which contains linked school records, university records, and tax records for everyone who took GCSEs in England since 2002. And what you can do with this data set is look at annual earnings at up to age 29, because basically the people who took GCSEs in England in 2002 aren't actually much older than that yet. So the oldest year we catch them in the data is age 29. And then the argument basically is that because we observe so much background information about them, their higher education choice might be as good as random, conditional on those characteristics, so the XI and the kind of theoretical discussion earlier. And just to give you a sense of what background information we've got in Leo, so one is prior attainment, which is really important. So GCSE results and A-level choices and results and so on. But we also have socioeconomic background, so things like free school meals, deprivation of the neighborhood where people grew up, whether they went to independent school, and so on. And finally, demographic characteristics, so things like ethnicity, region, gender, and whether someone speaks English as an additional language. And so here are some results from work we've done at IFS. Ignore those first three columns, but in the final column here, we see kind of what happens if you control for all of these factors. And as you can see, these results are done separately from men and women. And you see here that kind of alpha 1 you get here is reported in the table. So that's 0.04 for men and 0.23 for women. And that translates into a percentage return of 4% for men and 26% for women. So the idea here is that people who went to university or men who went to university at age 29 earn on average 4% more, and women earn on average 26% more as a result of going to university. So because they went to university, that's what comes out of this. Now, so far we have assumed that the return to higher education is the same for everyone. In the theoretical sections, I've just shown that that's clearly not true between men and women. But actually, returns also vary hugely by subject studied, by institution, and over the life cycle. So in the last few slides, I'm going to show you some evidence of heterogeneity along these dimensions. So first, here are financial returns by subject. So in black, you have the what you can call the raw difference. So that's just the difference between how much people earn who study these subjects at age 29 compared to people who got at least 5 A star to C at GCSE, but didn't go to university at all. And that's the blue line here. And you can see that everyone who went to university, all women who went to university, earn more than on average than in all subjects than women who didn't go to university, which is in the blue here. But then when you control for all the background characteristics, so most importantly, school attainment, then you see that the kind of estimated returns, so how much of these differences are actually truly the effect of higher education, goes down quite a lot. But we still see that medicine and economics, which have the highest earnings, also have the highest returns, whereas some other subjects, such as creative arts and social care, the returns are pretty small. This is the same for men. So it all looks pretty similar to the results for women, but interestingly here, it's all kind of shifted down a little bit. So there are actually some men who study some subject or who study creative arts actually earn less at age 29 than men who don't go to university at all, but have at least 5 A star to C at GCSE. If you look at the returns, actually returns are negative at age 29 for quite a few subjects. So we've looked at subjects. This is institutions. What you see here is that people who went to Russell Group universities tend to get higher returns than people who went to some non-Russell Group universities. So especially some of the kind of newer universities have relatively low returns. Sorry, this is women. If you look at men, again, the picture is similar, but it's kind of all shifted down a bit because in general, men have lower returns by age 29. But actually this changes over the life cycle. So if you do some simulation, I said to you, you can't actually observe people in the data beyond age 29, but you can do some simulation based on older cohorts. And what we see is that, or what we'd expect is that men appear to catch up quite a lot. So by age 40, the returns are actually similar to those of women, around 30%. So to conclude, there are many reasons why people do or do not go to university, financial or otherwise, and a model of higher education choices can help clarify how these factors together influence choices. Secondly, choices in a completely private higher education market may lead to underinvestment in higher education. And I've given 3 factors of why that might be. So one is financial market imperfections, then externalities, but also private suboptimal decisions. And these are reasons for governments to provide loans and subsidize higher education, which is what we observe in practice. And finally, financial returns to higher education can be estimated using ordinary least squares regression, provided that the exogeneity assumption holds, as I discussed, or with other methods. Just to show you, give you some OLS results for England, which I discussed. So to recap, the age 29 financial return is around 25% for women and 5% for men. But there is large heterogeneity in these returns, first of all by institution, but also by subject, and over the life cycle where we see men catching up. That's all for me. Thanks very much for listening.
Great, thanks, Ben. That was a really interesting talk, and I think quite topical given the ongoing debates about funding in higher education. We're getting in quite a few questions now, so I think I'll just jump into those. And please, everyone, continue to submit your questions or vote for questions that you want to be asked on Slido app. So the first one we have is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the government sticking with income contingent loans rather than switching to a graduate tax?
Okay, so so I guess I've sort of equated the two in my lecture, I guess. So I said, well, for most students in England, the system already acts like a graduate tax. And so these two options are actually more similar than some people, than one might think. So that's the first thing to say. So the difference comes in for people who have very high earnings. So we currently estimate that slightly less than 80% of people are going to pay off their loans slightly less than 80% of people are not going to pay off their loans in the current system. So for them, the system is just like a graduate tax at the moment. So that leaves slightly more than 20% of people for whom it's not, who are the highest earners. Now, for them, a graduate tax would mean that they would have to pay more because, well, obviously they couldn't pay off their loans under that system. So then the sort of other difference here is that currently the repayment period is limited to 30 years, and presumably a graduate tax would apply over the whole life cycle, but one could design that in different ways. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, so with the graduate tax, in principle, you could shift more of the burden of paying for higher education to the highest earners. Some might see this as an advantage. There's also kind of a potential disadvantage in the sense that you might think is unfair, in the sense that some people are going to pay way more for their education than it costs. I wouldn't want to take a stance on that. But I think the most difficult thing with a graduate tax is actually operational. How do you think about people who complete partial degrees? How do you think about people who change subject and so on? How are you going to deal with say, I mean, now it's kind of easier with EU students because they now pay international fees, but what about, say, Irish students who are still eligible for the same types of loans? How are they going to be taxed in Ireland? So I think there are some kind of real operational difficulties that make it hard to have a graduate tax.
Great, thanks. So our next question, which has been voted up, is why are men's estimated returns so different from women's at age 29?
So this is kind of a difficult one because we basically can't tell from the data that we have. I strongly suspect that it has a lot to do with fertility choices that come at a different time for graduate women typically than for those who don't go to university. So basically, women who don't go to university tend to have children earlier, and then tend to kind of drop out of the labor market for some time or reduce their hours. So that's why at a sort of early stage in the life cycles, like age 29, the returns look very large for women because, well, the kind of comparison group, many of them are working part-time or only partly in the labor market for part of the year. And we don't have that kind of same effect for men because becoming a father basically doesn't tend to have the same labor market effects as becoming a mother.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the next question we've had in is there an optimal level of tuition fees, and how would this relate to the current level?
Well, so I guess, well, basically, it's hard to know. So in theory, there's an optimal subsidy in any model that you're going to write down. In practice, what you want to achieve is from sort of purely economic point of view. There might be lots of other kind of non-economic reasons for having a student loan system in a certain way, but from purely a non-economic view, from a purely economic point of view, you want those people to attend university for whom it's socially optimal to do so. And I've sort of argued that it's probably socially optimal for more people to go than it's privately optimal to go because of externalities and so on. So that kind of would suggest that you don't want to put the whole cost of going to university on students. You want to subsidize it as a government. That's likely to be optimal. And that's in fact what we see in practice. Now, how much you want to subsidize it, whether it's socially optimal to subsidize it as much as, say, the English government does, or maybe it's optimal to subsidize it as much as it's subsidized in Scotland, which is substantially more, or as much as you see in, say, Denmark, which is even more. I think that's an open question.
And we have a slightly related question, which is there any data on how tuition fees would rise or fall if determined by the market rather than being set by government?
Well, so the short answer is not really. Or as I kind of alluded to, basically all systems that we see in the world have a substantial role for government in higher education funding. So there isn't a purely private market at all. One thing we did see in the UK is that, when the cap for the fees that could be set was raised from around £3,000 to £9,000 in 2012, basically all universities charged the maximum amount. So that kind of suggests that if you remove this cap now, fees would be higher than 9,000 still at many universities. And that same thing is also kind of suggested by looking at fees for international students, which also tend to be much higher than fees for domestic students. So yeah, I think it's safe to assume that if we didn't have a cap on fees, fees would be higher than they are now.
And now we actually have a question on not on fee caps, but student number caps. So how would student number caps affect tuition fees and the graduate earnings premium?
Okay, oh, that's a hard one. So so for tuition fees, well, so as I said, most universities charge the maximum level of tuition fees. So, you know, if the cap is not changed, basically the answer for tuition fees is not at all. So yeah, we would expect that if the caps stay the same, tuition fees stay the same, whatever is done to student numbers. The other thing is, the other question was, or the other part of the question was, how would it affect the graduate earnings premium? I think that is a very difficult question. Basically, we don't know. So, you know, economic theory might suggest, which is kind of what the question probably alludes to, that, you know, if you increase the supply of graduates, maybe the graduate premium is going to fall. And so similarly, if you restrict the supply of graduates through these number caps, the graduate premium might be higher than it otherwise would be. That argument makes a lot of sense. The only thing is that this is not what we've observed in the data. So, you know, in England and in other countries, we've seen a massive expansion of the higher education sector. So many more people now go to university than used to. And yet the graduate premium has been remarkably stable.
So another question we have is, can we use the subject and institution combinations, I think that means the returns estimates, to determine where an individual should or shouldn't attend university?
Well, I mean, it's certainly useful information, I think. So, you know, there's a lot of different factors that individuals should consider when making their university choice, and, you know, returns are clearly not everything, you know, and especially the returns for other people. So every individual may have a different experience. But I think looking at past cohorts, so, you know, how people have done who've attended this course in the past, is one kind of piece of the puzzle, and one important piece of information that people may want to look at, maybe just to get an idea. And certainly that's kind of what we're hoping with our research to achieve, that it would provide useful information for prospective students as well as for policymakers.
Great. So I think we're in the final couple of minutes, so I'll try and ask a couple more questions while we still have you here. So given the dependency on remote education, to what extent has COVID-19 affected the quality of the outcome of higher education?
Yeah, so that's kind of too early to say, I think. So, you know, given that the people who've kind of been most affected by this remote education aren't in the labor market yet, we don't know anything yet about what their outcomes are going to be. And it's going to be a while, because people tend to take a while to settle into the labor market. So, you know, by the time these people are in their late 20s, the people who've kind of finished or are finishing university now, we're going to have a clearer picture, but that's still several years away, I think.
Sure. So I think we'll go for a final question, which is, we'll go for a technical question. Mm-hmm. What sources of potential bias are you most concerned about in your OLS estimates of returns to higher education?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, I think. So the most concerning ones, I think, are that there's kind of unobservable factors, like, you know, I mentioned curiosity, but there's many others that may help you in the labor market, and that would also make you want to go to university. So maybe, in general, motivation might be one of those. So if you're a more motivated universal individual, maybe you want to both go to university and you're going to get a better job, or like ambition is also another one of those. So those are all factors that might lead us to overestimate their returns to higher education. On the other hand, as I mentioned, it doesn't all necessarily go that way. So there might also be other factors that may kind of pull in the other direction. So I think, as you allude to, I think because of those potential unobservables, these estimates should be taken with some grain of salt, but we do believe that they're the best estimates available, and we do think they are useful for people to, both for policymakers thinking about the design of the system and for individuals making decisions.
Great. Perfect timing. We're now on 5 o'clock. So I think we'll wrap up now. Big thanks again to Ben, and for our audience for joining and participating in the discussion. Another reminder that our final IFS public lecture is this time next week. And thanks again for everyone for attending.